Upon his ascension to supreme power after Lenin's death in January 1924, Stalin inherited a political system that had already violated the most basic principles of democracy. The organizing of nationwide elections had begun almost immediately after the Bolshevik coup of October 1917, but the elections were won by a rival party called the Socialist Revolutionaries, who left the Bolsheviks in second place. Rather than stepping down in face of the people's democratic decision, the Bolsheviks only abolished the institution that had organized the elections and accepted several pro-Bolshevik socialist revolutionaries into a coalition government led by the Bolsheviks, while their troops opened fire on the thousands of workers who protested against this blatant betrayal of democracy. During the course of the Russian Civil War of 1918-20, a complete one-party Bolshevik state was consolidated as the Socialist Revolutionary Coalition partners and other non-Bolsheviks were driven out of all government positions. In theory, the Soviet regime was supposed to be based, as the name suggests, on the authority of the local worker councils, or Soviets as they were called, that were first introduced in Russia in 1905. Both Lenin and Stalin had hailed these worker councils or Soviets as the truest form of proletarian democracy, and after the Bolshevik seizure of power, the delegates from these councils began to meet in a periodical Congress of Soviets to elect the Central Executive Committee that was therefore meant to embody the will of the local worker councils and constitute the highest office in the entire regime in the intervals between Soviet Congresses. Parallel to this Central Executive Committee, which was later reorganized to form a larger new body called the Supreme Soviet, there was a second government body in the Bolsheviks regime called the Council of People's Commissars, whose members the Central Executive Committee was supposed to appoint. In reality, however, the Council of People's Commissars answered to the independently existing Bolshevik Party, or more specifically, the political bureau of its Central Committee, whose 4 leading members were granted emergency powers on November 29, 1917, to decide any matters they pleased. Earlier that month, shortly before replacing the chairman of the Central Executive Committee with one of his closest allies, Lenin had pushed through a decree that allowed the Council of People's Commissars to bypass the authority of the Central Executive Committee and the Soviet Congress. From there on, the Council of People's Commissars began to unofficially take over the daily responsibilities and tasks of the Central Executive Committee, and by early 1919, When the body was taken over by Mikhail Kalinin, the latter had become little more than a symbolic formality in the decision-making process in the Soviet regime. The Bolshevik Party nominally worked roughly according to the same formula as the Soviets. A party congress was to meet annually, and there the party delegates elected a central committee, which in turn comprised of 3 subcommittees: the Political Bureau, usually called the Politburo, the Secretariat, and the Organizational Bureau, or Orgbureau. This internal party democracy was hardly respected by the leading party figures, who often manipulated the party congress elections that determined the central committee membership, and the situation only got worse after Stalin officially became the head of the party secretariat in 1922. As mentioned in Part 1, Stalin used his newly acquired influence as the General Secretary to bring regional party leaders under the control of his secretariat, and he also established his own department within the party called the Secret Department, which represented a link between the Bolshevik Party and the political police, and was subordinated only to Stalin, and, as later came to be the case in his absence, his Politburo deputy. During the Russian Civil War of 1918–20, the Soviet political police, or Cheka, had already become notorious for its murderous extrajudicial practices, which the party inflamed with calls for terror. In the much smoother years of the 1920s, the political police changed name first to GPU and then OGPU, but underneath the new title, the same extrajudicial practices and indiscriminate arrests continued. This was the organization whose functions Stalin could now appropriate for dealing with opponents, and he frequently communicated with the political police, sometimes forcing through personnel changes or demanding more intensive action in its general operations. Coordinating a regime the size of the Soviet Union would never have been possible by one man alone, not even a man like Stalin, who did possess an exceptional intellect, phenomenal capacity for hard work, and the combined discipline and willpower of at least a million simps. From the early 1920s onwards, Stalin gathered around him fellow party fanatics and Marxist true believers who were willing to follow his lead out of ideological conviction primarily. The most important one of Stalin's allies was Vyacheslav Molotov, whose unwavering loyalty to the party line, commitment to collectivization, and scorn for Gulag class enemies that was outdone by few made him the ideal chairman of the highest council of People's Commissars, which is where Stalin placed him in 1930 and thus promoted Molotov to the second man in the regime. Another very important member of the Stalin team was Lazar Gaganovich, who became Stalin's deputy in the party as Molotov took the chairman's seat in the Council of People's Commissars in 1930. Naturally, Kaganovich was cut from the same ideological cloth as Stalin, being negligent of democracy and adamant on the importance of party discipline and state power. He was loyal to the point of subservience to Stalin and enjoyed the peak of his power in the first half of the 1930s, when he was in the top three of the regime and presented a serious challenge to Molotov's status as Stalin's right-hand man. Stalin's inner circle also included, most notably at this time, the Red Army representative in the Politburo, Kliment Voroshilov, the Trade and Supply Commissariat juggler Anastas Mikoyan, and Grigory or Sergo Orjonikidze, who ran the colossal heavy industry commissariat. In the 1920s, Stalin had encouraged a more relaxed and self-critical leadership approach, and Kaganovich later recalled with fondness these years when Stalin was not yet the dictator he would transform into after the beginning of the first five-year plan in late 1928. Part 2 showed that Stalin and his team were headstrong on achieving rapid collectivization and industrialization with the first five-year plan, but some Bolsheviks considered such over-ambitious goals as dangerous and instead argued for moderation. All these skeptics and their supporters, who likewise opposed the foolishly radical policies championed by Stalin, quickly bloated in Stalin's eyes from being just communists with rather minor policy disagreements to corrupted right-wing enemy sympathizers who must be wishing for the restoration of capitalism. In a nutshell, right deviation or right opposition. Stalin personally led the campaign of arrests and executions against the right deviation, and its leading figures were purged from the party and state apparatus, alongside many of their followers and the bourgeois specialists that were also viewed as being opposed to the party line. It was no longer just imagined class enemies and non-Bolshevik leftists that got caught in the repressions, since for Stalin and his supporters, neutrality or leniency had become tantamount to being on the side of the enemy, and they had learned to ascribe fictitious yet nefarious goals and intentions, which Stalin and his supporters seemed to have genuinely believed were accurate, to anyone who hesitated to adopt a relentlessly hard-line position against capitalism and suspected enemies. After the defeat of the so-called right deviation in the very early 1930s, not many would dare to criticize or diverge from Stalin's line. Stalin had now established hegemony for his group in both the party and the government, and he would play an increasingly assiduous role in organizing repression against party cadres while sacking individuals whom he distrusted or who proved themselves too independently minded. The collective decision-making process, what was left of it, suffered a blow in the 1930s when Politburo meetings declined from about 50 per year to only 2 per year, because it was becoming fashionable for the Stalin clique to simply decide matters in private meetings in Stalin's office rather than in any formal sessions. The annual party congress, where the Central Committee members were to be elected, suddenly stopped being so annual in the 1930s when it convened only 3 times throughout that whole decade before taking a 12-year break from convening at all. The party congress then returned in 1952, right after which Stalin would make an appeal out of the blue for his own resignation, something he had not done since his softer years in the mid-1920s. But by now the party atmosphere was vastly different than that of the mid-1920s, and no one could have fallen for what probably amounted to a test. Nearly half of all the delegates and the great majority of the Central Committee members elected at the mid-1930s Party Congress had been murdered during the wave of repression that technically began in late 1934 in response to the assassination of a Politburo member, but then in 1937 to 38 spiraled into a vicious countrywide campaign of terror against alleged spies and traitors, which can't be in its entirety made to fit the scope of this video. In the initial show trials of 1936, many of Stalin's former opponents from the 1920s were accused and later executed on charges of participating in a conspiracy masterminded from abroad by Trotsky for the purpose of assassinating Stalin and everyone he associated with. The repression escalated to a new level in 1937 when Stalin's former opponents from the early 1930s were arrested and later shot, and the mass arrests of ordinary citizens began. The party and state apparatus also came under fire, as did the military apparatus and the political police, which was doing the arresting and shooting now under the aegis of the Union Internal Affairs Commissariat, or NKVD. The attack on the party and state apparatus was largely provoked by the fact that many had personal loyalties that went beyond Stalin, and reluctance to join the purging had been widespread. Examples had to be made of those who refused to turn on their comrades without mercy, and such was the fate of the heavy industry leader Ordzhonikidze, who had firmly defended the people working under his heavy industry commissariat from accusations of enemy spying and sabotage. Ordzhonikidze was finding himself in hot water in early 1937 as he continued to provide financial support to the widow of a disgraced former party member and tried to thwart the new wave of repression that Stalin was pushing for. In mid-February 1937, Ordzhonikidze realized that his days were numbered and it seems he preempted his show trial by taking his own life, although there's a chance he might have actually been assassinated. Other leading Bolshevik figures quickly fell in line with Stalin and became crazed murderers and terror organizers roughly from that point, while often making a display of what was supposed to be their bottomless contempt of suspected enemies, as if to demonstrate how virtuously committed to the cause they were by being the least tolerant of the imagined enemy. The action against the general population consumed the bulk of the NKVD activity during the years of the terror and came under the cover of two operations against anti-Soviet elements and foreign spies, respectively. Stalin had been the one to remind his subordinates as the mass repression was about to begin that the country was filled with spies and murderers sent by capitalists who were only waiting for the outbreak of war to stab the Soviet Union in the back. Throughout 1937 to 38, Stalin emerged as the staunchest supporter of the mass repression, and he signed directives to speed up the NKVD sentencing process, raised the arrest quotas, and endlessly egged on the NKVD chief Nikolai Yezhov, who was the second most frequent visitor in Stalin's office in the terror years, spending a total of 855 hours conversing privately with the dictator. Executions of ungodly amounts of people first occurred in the Soviet regime in 1918 to 20, when 100,000 or 200,000 people were executed under Lenin, who was an outspoken advocate of political terror and murder, and remained so even after the Russian Civil War had come to a close. But Lenin's terror pales in comparison to Stalin's terror of 1937 to 38, which claimed the lives of at least 700,000 and perhaps as many as 800,000. This episode, known as the Great Terror, left a permanent mark on the Soviet leadership. Members of the existing elite, who had earlier enjoyed a relative amount of independence, were either forced into total obedience to Stalin or killed if they got cold feet or had even questioned Stalin in the past, while new cadres were promoted to the top as the whole party-state apparatus was being reshuffled, the most important ones of whom were the Leningrad party leader Andrei Zhdanov and Georgy Malenkov, who was a party apparatus manager of a sort and whom Stalin might have been blackmailing. With the Great Terror, Stalin had successfully broken the regime elite into compliant minions that recognized his sole authority, and their relationship was increasingly based on fear as the dictator continued to terrorize his subordinates to test their loyalty, like when he attacked Kaganovich's brother and Molotov's wife. Stalin now enjoyed unconstrained power and could have pretty much anyone he wanted killed or incarcerated. Thus the dictatorship was complete. But how much room did Stalin's despotism leave for workers' democracy? Well, it's clear that the regime tried to maintain the earlier mentioned workers' councils, the actual Soviets, as genuine bodies of workers' self-governance, even though the candidates at the worker council elections were appointed by the Bolshevik Party. The new constitution that came into effect in 1936 was meant to secure more inclusive Soviet elections, but did little to alter the role of the Bolshevik Party in directing them. The executive committee which Soviet elections determined had long since ceased to play an important part in the politics of the regime, and the head of this committee, Lenin, never belonged to the leading group of the regime after the late 1920s and was strictly kept in line by Stalin. Stalin was therefore undoubtedly correct when he told privately his right-hand man, who remained to the very end of his life a hardcore Stalin supporter and an apologist for the Great Terror and other crimes of Stalin, that it was not the working class that ruled in the Soviet Union. In addition to the tens of millions that were arrested and possibly subjected to torture, which was made illegal in the Soviet Union only after Stalin's death in 1953, and the uncertain number of people who perished among the about 26 million that were incarcerated in labor camps or driven into exile as gulags, the Stalin dictatorship claimed the lives of nearly 1 million people through face-to-face executions, and as many as 7 or 8 million people through famine deaths in 1931 to 33. The Soviet regime officially denied the existence of this famine. Stalin attributed any claims of such things to fascist agitation, and the Soviet statisticians that accidentally discovered in 1937 that the country was mysteriously missing about 8 million people were called fascists for their outrageous findings and arrested when they couldn't explain away the population decline no matter how they fiddled with the data. The 1937 population census was quietly postponed by the authorities to the year 1939, but the 1939 census seemed to support the earlier findings. This largely man-made mass destruction of human life was preceded by Lenin's slightly less severe regime, which had executed 100,000 or 200,000 people and killed, unintentionally of course, at least 5 million with the famine that had begun in 1921. Long before the true extent of this death and suffering had become known to the public, many prominent contemporary socialist figures had denounced the anti-democratic Soviet system of terror, such as the German communist leader Rosa Luxemburg, and the Austrian socialist leader Karl Kautsky, who leaned towards the Bernstein revisionist interpretation of Marxism and regarded socialism more in the line of a utopian ideal that would end all forms of oppression and inequality, be that on the basis of class, race, or gender. Karl Marx, on the other hand, whose theories formed the foundation of Stalin's and Lenin's ideology, believed in the supremacy of class struggle and that those other inequalities would unravel from the abolition of class distinctions, which should be the main focus. For him, the use of authoritarian measures to achieve this was a foregone conclusion, and the possibility of a non-violent revolution was maintained only for a selected few countries. Marx argued for an energetic dictatorship and the use of the government to oppress bourgeois class enemies for as long as they exist, while his colleague Engels drew inspiration explicitly from the vanquished Paris Commune of 1872 and wrote that a revolution would be the most authoritarian thing there is and could only endure by means of terror. The Bolsheviks had taken the lessons of the failed revolutions of the mid-1800s to heart as well, and they, including one who is too often treated with completely undeserved respect by Western intellectuals, had no intentions of repeating the failure of the Paris Commune by skimping on the dictatorship or sparing any enemies. This was particularly true in the aftermath of the Russian Civil War of 1918–20, in which surrounding capitalist powers had partaken on the side of anti-Bolshevik forces, much to the confusion of recipients of Marxist class struggle ideology. It's of course impossible to tell to what degree the specter of capitalist/imperialist intervention was later concocted merely to justify the police state, but the existence of such an institution is not as easy to condemn from a Marxist perspective as one might think, especially since the leftist critics of Soviet dictatorialness have never gotten the opportunity to demonstrate how their commitments to freedom could actually work in practice. When it comes to the economic aspects, most modern socialists seem to agree that here too Stalin and Lenin embodied some sort of distortion of socialist principles.
We should recognize what I think is true, I've written about it plenty myself, that the Bolshevik Revolution, so-called revolution, it was really a coup, was really a counter-revolution, which placed state power in the hands of a highly authoritarian, anti-socialist group, which within a couple of months had destroyed the factory councils, had destroyed the Soviets. It has nothing to do with socialism. They destroyed socialism within weeks. They didn't wait. By 1918, it was finished.
The viewpoint expressed in that clip by one of the leading leftist intellectuals of modern times, Noam Chomsky, is widely shared by many socialists and communists in the online leftist community, such as the popular leftist YouTubers Peter Coffin and Vaush, to name a few.
left-wing ideologies such as communism, anarchism, socialism, and everything in between all have different ways and means of doing it, but the intent is to ensure that the worker owns the means of production and therefore their labor. I'm sure somebody out there is thinking, but the USSR, but China, but Venezuela. Well, it's quite possible to call yourself communist, but really be a totalitarian regime bent on exploiting labor for your own profit. What you call yourself doesn't really matter if you're not doing it.
What are your thoughts on the USSR under Stalin? Do you think it was state capitalist or socialist? It was never socialist. The workers never had anything even approaching control of the means of production at any point during Stalin's reign over the USSR. Not even fucking close.
It's not difficult to see why these and other socialists of the anarchist libertarian branch of socialism would refuse to recognize as socialist the undemocratic state-coordinated economy of the Soviet Union, but Stalin and Lenin were not anarchists or libertarian socialists who insist on worker control over the means of production and oppose socialization by state means. Marxist theory unambiguously postulates that the state is an essential part of the proletarian revolution. Since cooperatively owned workplaces alone are not enough to overthrow capitalism, the working class needs to seize state power and centralize the means of production and transform them into social property via the state until the economic foundations of classes have been erased and socialism, i.e. the lower phase of communism, can transition into stateless communism. Moreover, in contrast to anarchism and libertarian socialism, the essence of socialism or communism, according to Marxist theory, is not worker control or opposition to unjust hierarchies, but the negation of capitalistic private property and the capitalist mode of production. We saw in parts 1 and 2 how the Bolsheviks nationalized virtually all of industry, how the capitalists were uprooted, and how Soviet agriculture went from the overthrow of landlords to state-directed collective farms where the means of production were in common ownership. We also saw how in 1921 and then in 1931 to 33, the Bolsheviks and tens of millions of famine victims learned the hard way that establishing socialist product exchange in place of markets is not as simple as it is on paper. Stalin's regime coped with the struggles of the first 5-year plan by making a permanent U-turn from the ration system to financial incentives and internal markets. Hereby goods were technically produced to be sold on markets, and workers continued to receive wages, but on closer examination these seem only superficial resemblances to the capitalist mode of production. Wage labor, in the Marxist meaning of the term, referred to a more specific condition than just workers receiving wages, and in fact presupposed exploitation of workers by capitalists that pocket the surplus value, which under socialism would be invested in the betterment of the society as a whole. What Marx termed commodity production did not simply mean that goods are exchanged with money and produced for something else other than immediate consumption by producers, since that could take place without creating or sustaining capital if the practical utility of the goods, i.e. the use value, determines the transaction. In capitalism, the object is profit, and goods are by and large produced for the purpose of being circulated on chaotic markets for the accumulation of capital. In other words, it's the exchange value that dominates, not use value, although there tends to be a relationship between the two. In the Soviet Union, however, 80 to 90% of the markets were subjected to heavy regulation and planning by the state, and production in all sectors took place according to comprehensive economic plans, as seen in Part 2. This is roughly why it's not easy to say to what extent the Soviet system amounted merely to state-coordinated distribution of goods produced exclusively with use value in mind, and with money serving as a medium, and to what extent commodity production, as Marx and Engels referred to it, and in that sense a retreat from Marxist principles. Still, the Soviet system was not what Marx and Engels had in mind when they wrote that in socialism, or lower phase of communism, goods would be produced directly for the purpose of consumption and acquired by means of labor certificates rather than money that accumulates. Today, however, we're not concerned with the question of whether the Bolsheviks managed to arrive at socialism precisely how Marx and Engels had outlined in their theories, or whether they had fully arrived there at all. While the term socialism might even be too convoluted to serve much purpose in these conversations, it's clear that Stalin and Lenin were putting Marxist theory into practice and abolished capitalism, regardless of whether that fits one's definition of socialism, and therefore the lessons to be learned from these two men are of significance for anyone who likewise adopts Marxism as their philosophy and seeks to abolish capitalism. Stalin and Lenin were unquestionably Marxist socialists, which, again, is not to be confused with saying that they successfully arrived at any socialism, and they did eliminate capitalist private property and the capitalist mode of production in the Soviet Union, even if the conditions did not allow socialism to be established in the way Marx and Engels had envisioned. All of it, of course, came at the expense of liberty and democracy, and this is, I believe, where the crux of the matter lies. If you hark back to the beginning of this segment or to my older videos, you will get a glimpse at the scale of human suffering brought about by Stalin's and Lenin's efforts at socializing the means of production in the countryside and driving out the petty bourgeois peasants, and if I'm at least approximately correct in my conclusions, then the ethically sound way forward for modern Marxists and communists would lie in figuring out how to ensure it couldn't happen again, not in working your way backwards from uncomfortable realities and trying to pretend that Stalin was not a real Marxist or that his policies did not lead to the annihilation of millions of lives. To be sure, there was a lot more at play than just Marxist ideology. The experience of the First World War, repression by the Tsarist political police Akhranka, immiseration of and Tsarist brutality towards Russian workers, and Russia's peculiar position in geopolitics and world history molded the Bolsheviks into the hardened revolutionaries that they were, and one can scarcely imagine an outcome resembling the Soviet regime as we know it without the lining up of these and other specific historical circumstances that do not influence modern times in any direct way. Moreover, the Soviet Union consisted of backward peasant countries, the difficulties associated which are unlikely to play a part in modern Marxist or socialist movements, so one can sigh with relief at the fact that not in a million years could even the most devoted modern Marxist-Leninist Stalin admirers replicate anything beyond a tiny fraction of Stalin's and Lenin's regime, terrifying as that tiny fraction of millions of people killed might be. However, modern socialism is far from being dominated by Marxist-Leninist Stalin admirers, and today in fact Marxist ideals about the centrality of class struggle have by and large been supplanted by race, gender and sexual orientation-based struggle, pretty much like in most other forms of left-wing politics. Of course, the Bolsheviks were fully committed to social justice as well, meaning to ending racism, sexism and other forms of discrimination, although complete equality was scheduled only for the final phase of the revolution. Stalin's regime in the 1920s was the first country in the world to try to tackle the gender wage gap, for example, but we saw in Part 2 how the Bolsheviks were again forced to backtrack when it came time to actually implement policies, as they struggled during the crisis-ridden first five-year plan to balance earlier egalitarianism and worker control of the economy with the need for incentives and industrious economic planning. We saw how in this struggle the forces of hierarchy and centralization just about always came out on top and undermined traditional socialist principles, and a new intelligentsia strata or elite began to emerge out of the Soviet nomenclatura system, which enjoyed much more comfortable living conditions than the average worker. Here too the role of ideology must not be overstated, since I'm sure you remember from part 2 that violence and coercion were left as pretty much the only options for the Bolsheviks, who were faced with a complicated dilemma involving lack of voluntary support for socialist agriculture, international developments that provoked anxiety and fears of invasion, and the remaining population of petty capitalists, kulaks, that could allegedly endanger the entire socialist project. It's one thing for other socialists to condemn the Soviet regime for failing to live up to socialist ideals about equality and freedom and for regressing into terror. It's another to find a way to guarantee that those who are likewise committed to the abolition of capitalism would not resort to coercive measures in a similar situation or to violence generally. Some historians believe it's impossible to realize the economic ideals of socialism without spoiling its moral principles, but surely the starting point for less destructive socialist and especially Marxist movements would be to develop an antidote to the totalitarian Bolshevik spirit of black and white Sith absolutism that drove the repression and murder. Lying at the root of Bolshevik thinking, there seemed to be an unchallengeable assumption about the piety and absolute moral righteousness of their worldview, and since questioning that righteousness and piety they were so certain of equated to heresy, they were unable to comprehend that opposition to their radical worldview could stem from honest disagreements. Thus, it had to have been organized by malevolent enemy forces. This is, according to my familiarity with the subject, how the Bolsheviks managed to always come to such extremely over-the-top interpretations of their opponents and their motives. The critics of the forced collectivization and rapid industrialization Stalin believed was necessary for the survival of the regime had to become rightists and advocates of capitalism who were aiding the enemy. The German Social Democrats had to become social fascists. Peasant workers who were unenthusiastic about their way of life being turned upside down by the collectivization had to become kulak class enemies. In some cases, those that acknowledged simple facts that would expose the moral corruption of the Soviet project had to become fascists or mouthpieces of fascism, and so on. It did not matter to the Bolsheviks whether the individual was a rightist, an advocate of capitalism, a kulak class enemy, or some kind of a fascist in the true meaning of the word, just like it did not matter if he actually was a spy in 1937-38, when hundreds of thousands of spies were arrested and shot. But if he was perceived as standing against Soviet power, then he might as well be a spy, a fascist, a class enemy, etc., because the political radical cannot see the difference. Individual intentions were of no concern to the Bolsheviks. For them, all those that could harm Soviet power and its righteous mission of building social justice utopia in any way, be that out of ignorance or conviction, were enemies to be destroyed just the same. Thank you for watching.